Welcome. My name is Nina Hunteman, Professor of Communication and Journalism at Suffolk University and a Somerville resident. Youth violence is a serious problem in high schools throughout the United States. According to the Eastern Illinois University, nearly 1 million high school athletes are victims of hazing rituals every year. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services stated that the youth violence affects all communities, urban and rural, wealthy and poor. Playing sports helps children develop self-confidence, build self-esteem, and offers health and social advantages. On the other hand, there have been recent incidences involving high school sports players and participation in acts like hazing, violence, and rape. In August of 2013, the community was shocked to learn that a rape occurred at a soccer camp involving 3 Somerville youth athletes. We are here today to have a conversation with experts in the field to help shed light on youth violence in our society. I'm joined by Ricardo Grandois, who is from the Center for Sports and Society at Northeastern University, Patty Contente, who is from Somerville's Trauma Response Network, and Barbara Ham, who's the director of the Victims of Violence program at Cambridge Health Alliance. And first, we'll hear a little bit about what each one of them do. Ricardo?
Yeah, so I work for the Center for the Study of Sport and Society at Northeastern University. And what I do is I am a program manager, but primarily I work with youth at the high school level to train them around various issues specific to teen dating violence, as well as bullying prevention tactics. We use the leadership education platform, specifically the bystander approach, to empower youth.
Great. Patty?
So I work for the City of Somerville in the health department, and my role with the health department, part of my role is to run the Trauma Response Network. The Trauma Response Network is a group of volunteers in the community who are trained in post-traumatic stress management with the idea to support individuals who experienced a traumatic, unexpected incident to really promote healthy coping, raise awareness about the reality that trauma impacts us all at different levels, and we need to be aware of that in order to make choices and move forward in a positive, healthy way.
Barbara?
And I direct the Victims of Violence program at the Cambridge Health Alliance. The Cambridge Health Alliance is a system of 3 hospitals and multiple neighborhood health clinics, and the Victims of Violence program serves adults 18 and over who've been victimized in any way. And we provide a range of services from direct clinical care and research and free services that are offered through the Mass Office of Victim Assistance for homicide survivors and for victim advocacy.
So the reason why we've brought you all here today, and thank you for joining us, is to sort of understand in a broader context youth violence in particular. And of course, this has been instigated by the events that happened over the summer that really shocked and devastated a lot of us in the Somerville community around the sports team that was away on a sports training retreat. So first, I'd like to just understand, just briefly from you, Ricardo, we're starting to understand this incident as hazing. Can you explain to us what hazing typically is, how we might define it in our society?
Hazing is basically an initiation. Usually happens within sports teams, and it's a way to build a community or a brotherhood, but unfortunately the approach is usually one that has more negative repercussions than expected.
And you said brotherhood, so I'm wondering, is there a particular gendered nature to hazing? I understand it happens in both girls and boy groups, but is there more prevalence among young boys?
I would argue no. I think, again, I use the word brotherhood loosely. I think, again, it's a cohesion tactic, usually perpetrated by a group, but I don't necessarily think that it is gender specific.
Yeah. And is it often sexual in nature, or is this particular incident that we saw in Somerville kind of unusual?
I honestly would say that it isn't necessarily sexual in nature. Again, it is a way to create a bond And for whatever reason, I think in this specific incident, it was sexual in nature. But in most cases, I would say that it is just a tactic that's used to basically bring the newer members up to speed with the cohesion of the team, and it's usually putting that newer member in a position that's compromising. So I would say no.
Yeah. And you had mentioned that you use some leadership training.
Yes.
How might the training you provide address the potentiality of hazing and hopefully, train young people to recognize it and not obviously participate in such activities?
Sure. So again, yes, we do a lot of leadership education, and what that really entails is empowering young people as bystanders to prevent something when they see it happening. So the bystander approach usually states that in most situations, most people think that they have two options as a bystander, and that's to either directly get involved in a negative situation or do nothing at all. Now, if a person is in a position to directly get involved, they have their safety they have to worry about. So with our training, what we do is we empower young people or the people we are training with tools that allow them to think of other options that they can take to intervene in a situation, such as what happened here in Somerville, so that they themselves don't necessarily have to feel like they're putting themselves in danger.
Patty, hazing in Somerville sports, it sort of shocked us all. I'm assuming it's not a normal thing, it's not a usual thing. Could you give us some context for understanding this historically?
Sure. And I have to say that I don't know that in this particular incident that we're looking at as a hazing incident. Although I can understand kind of in the context of hazing how these things occur, but that I just wanted to say that hasn't been the focus. It's really been more on an issue of sexual violence that occurred in this situation. And that's how it's been addressed. But typically, this was, as you mentioned to start, it was shocking and surprising for the entire community. In particular, the athletic department and the sports community for the school. This is not something that they've had encounters. I'm sure there have been incidents, as Riccardi was mentioning. It tends to be, a way for teams, for any organization. When this occurred, I did a little Googling expertise and found that it's not only with sports. You hear most often about it in sports teams, but it could be with religious groups. It could be with any kind of group where you're trying to create that cohesion and get that kind of camaraderie almost. And so it was surprising. It's not something that the school has dealt with at any significant level. Certainly there was talk of how, yes, sometimes the sports culture is that the freshmen have to carry all the water in the heavy equipment bags, but beyond that, there hadn't been any points of concern where the school would have thought that this even could have been a possibility. So it was very surprising and shocking, and I think, when we talk about does this happen with boys and girls, I think you're absolutely right that it does. One of the things that I've come to understand is that there's the different ways that it does come out is that boys tend to be more aggressive and physical as opposed to girls who tend to be more emotionally bullying and target that aspect of things. And unfortunately, it does seem that there is a sexual component to hazing, if you look not in Somerville particularly, but across. Over the last decade, there's been a number of reports looking at different levels of sexualized behavior in hazing rituals. So it is something that I think we need to look at in terms of a broader context, in terms of what is our culture around raising young people, around healthy relationships. What are the things that we need to be considering as we move forward with a very changing society in terms of all of the information points that youth have access to with media and internet and so forth, and how are we modeling expectations and also, guiding informed behavior and choices so that kids are more aware of what's acceptable, what's not, and why. Why isn't it acceptable? And what can you do as a bystander? I think that's a great approach.
You bring up a really important point is understanding this understanding violence generally
Yeah.
in society, and that's, Barbara, where your expertise lies. I wonder if you can help us understand violence in our culture from your perspective. I know you've been working in this area for 30 years, and so over that vast experience, what might you say about characterizing violence in our culture?
That it's so prevalent. I have been working for about 30 years in the field. And on a day-to-day level, I'm encountering every form of violence really imaginable. So I come from somewhat of a slanted point of view because I hear this all the time. But what seems really consistent is how the numbers don't decrease, that violence is so prevalent, and it's really hard as a society to recognize how prevalent it is, that it's painful for people, I think, to really acknowledge the levels of violence and the extent of it. The numbers, the statistics are that 1 in 4 women, as an adult, have encountered an unwanted sexual event in their lifetime. And for men, it's 1 in 7, and those numbers may not be accurate. And this is in their lifetime, and many of those unwanted sexual experiences occur when they're young. So we know that childhood sexual abuse is really prevalent. And I don't actually think that there are numbers around child to child, the peer pressure. There may be, but I'm just not aware of it. But there is a lot of sexualized, aggressive behavior in our society. And I think that we see that in the children, particularly with the new forms of social media. I'm just becoming aware of the bullying, the cyberbullying that takes place that has some extreme sexual overtones to it. So it is a public health issue that needs to be addressed, and so I continue to do this work for that reason.
What do you think explains the prevalence of violence in our culture over so long? What might be some of the causes?
Well, I think some of it is there's a sort of a transgenerational transmission of trauma. So when somebody has been traumatized, even they, and as a society, when societies have experienced trauma, families, societies have experienced it, that there is a way, when it's unprocessed, it just inadvertently gets transmitted. So there's also an acceptance of it. If this happened to me, on some level is going to continue to happen, a sense of disempowerment that people feel. And with that disempowerment often is an inability to really see what's happening accurately. So there might be an overestimation of what's happening or an underestimation of what's happening, and a denial of what's happening. There's secrecy and shame that occurs when acts of violence are perpetrated. The secrecy and shame of the perpetrator sometimes, and also of the victim and the victim's families and neighborhoods, so that it's hard to take action. As Riccardi was saying, I think the bystander is such an important role. I'm glad you're doing that work, because so often we're in that bystander position and immobilized and not knowing how to really respond responsibly without getting hurt ourselves or implicating somebody else. So that fear of implicating others or the fear of retaliation is enormous.
And I would imagine that, especially among youth, if hazing or other kinds of bonding rituals are about being part of a group, the last thing you want to do is stand up as a bystander and separate yourself from that group. So how do you counter that in young people who are just learning who they are and their place in that society, in that community, and then certainly in the culture at large?
So, again, I think we start with the leadership piece. We define what leadership is and all the qualities that make a leader. And part of the whole leadership aspect is that it's hard, and recognizing that it's hard. And I think once people have that understanding, then they're aware that the decision they're going to make may have repercussions that may not be the best for them on an individual level. But in thinking of themselves as leaders, that helps them to then do what needs to be done in order to protect themselves or others.
So really pulling on their sense of responsibility for others as a
Exactly.
leader, right? Patty, how has Somerville responded to this, as you said, as an act of sexual violence, specifically, that might help us understand how we move forward?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things that the school and the city did right away was to look at how could we support those most immediately impacted. So ensuring that people had resources and information on agencies such as Barbara's and the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, who partnered with us, as well as the Teen Connection, which is the Cambridge Health Alliance clinic that is attached to the high school, servicing youth aged 12 to 24 around a variety of issues, including sexual health. And so trying to really highlight what the local community supports were. We met with the staff who were at the camp to talk with them, and really to try to support them through this difficult time, and also help them to understand how this could happen. I think that was one of the most shocking things. How could this have happened in a supervised environment, right? We've probably gone to camp, send our kids to camp. Our kids are independent, right? This was a camp for adolescents, high school students. So at that stage, they're not, under, it's not like having a toddler where you're watching them every minute to ensure their safety. And I think that was the thing that everyone grappled with the most. And unfortunately, the reality is that most child abuse, sexual abuse happens not far from adult supervision. And so that comes back to why trainings such as what Riccardi's doing around bystander training. The schools have a current social competency program that they're instituted from kindergarten through 8th grade. And then they also do things at the high school level. But the social competency really tries to integrate throughout their schooling years. How do you be part of a healthy community? What's your role? And it addresses specifics around bullying, around substance use, healthy relationships, to try to build a foundation for youth around expectations. But when something does happen, the Trauma Response Network then did work with the schools. We collaborated with BARC quite significantly, which is a wonderful resource. They came out and spoke to parent groups. We offered coping groups for students who were impacted, as well as staff, to allow them the time to process, as Barbara was saying. Oftentimes our first reaction is, this is awful, why do I need to want to talk about this anymore? And the reason you need to is because it's there. It happened, and it's not going to go away. And so really to get in touch with how you're feeling about that, trying to make sense of that, so then you can be available to others to help them make sense of that. So we offered a number of groups for the coaches as well as the student staff, and provided information to the community around resources. And knowledge that, part of what the trauma response team emphasizes is, again, that impact that trauma has. Not everyone reacts the same, will have the same reaction or needs related to a trauma experience. However, it's not unusual for things to come up after the fact. That the fact is, when something like this happens in a community, it can trigger past traumas. I think Barbara was addressing that as well. So just the knowledge that it's not abnormal to have unusual responses, like trouble concentrating, or feeling a little more fatigued, or feeling like you're having trouble making decisions. And it could be related to this experience, as well as it bringing up past experiences, and talking about what might help you to understand better when you need to reach out for more professional help, and to encourage people to reach out and ask questions. Primary care providers are a great resource. Mental health professionals are a great resource. Agencies like and programs like Victims of Violence or BARC or the Teen Health Connection is a great place for people to go and say, I'm not sure, but I've been experiencing this, what can I do? And so that's really how the city has tried to support the community and reinforce that if there are needs, there are resources and programs and people in the community available to help and assist.
And this isn't necessarily those who were only perhaps victims or witnesses. I mean, this can really affect even kids back at school who were friends and weren't on the team, but just know that this happened in the community. I mean, these resources are not just for immediate, if you will.
Absolutely,
witnesses.
Nina. So that's I'm so glad you brought that up, because it could be even someone who's not even closely connected, but this could trigger a past incident in their lives, and have unexpected kind of impact on someone. So yes, to understand that is really important, and there is that ripple, and especially if I say the best treatment recommendation right now is to shut off the news.
Yes, shut off the news.
I appreciate you saying that, because I'd like us to talk about, I'd like us to talk about the news's influence and the media's influence, and perhaps not just the incidences occurring, but how we respond to them.
Yeah.
To any of my guests, like what do you see as the media's part to play, not blame, but part to play in how we understand these incidences and maybe even why they occur?
Yeah.
One thing I think is that for the media to really put things in context. So often there's a narrow focus, and there's the impulse to blame or to really try to locate responsibility within a group or an individual, and also to reify or to really bring the focus to one incident. So in our experience, what will happen, say we're moving it from Somerville for a minute to other incidences of violence that might be occurring in a community. When the focus is on that incident, there's usually either a good victim or a bad victim. A good victim probably is white and has some social class status, and a bad victim is a person of color who doesn't have that. They don't get as much press, and the good victim gets an enormous amount of. I'm just using good and bad as, who gets resourced and who doesn't.
And there's something incredibly appealing and simple about the good versus evil dichotomy, right? So you make a good victim or a bad victim, or a good situation or bad situation, so it's more understandable. It's something that I often teach my students about when they're watching news media is to consider, like, what is not in the story? What are all the things that perhaps are not being covered and that we're not seeing because of that frame of needing it to be a kind of narrative that's simple and straightforward and understandable. What are the things perhaps that we've seen to any of my guests that, or not seen in the coverage that we should be seeing that would help people process this, maybe who are in the next town or the next state or watching this in the national news?
I think for me, it's thinking about, so we're talking about violence, and we know that boys generally are more aggressive than girls when it comes to committing violence acts. And I think the question is around how are we acculturating manhood in this country? And how are we addressing healthy masculinity? And if boys are seeing in the media that men are supposed to be tough, men are supposed to behave a certain way, and that's the type of message that they're getting, in turn, I think it makes them feel okay when they commit an act, such as the one that we saw that happened here, where it's like, okay, well, I'm a man. I'm going to, show my manhood by making someone less than a man, quote unquote. So I think those are the type of questions we should be asking as it relates to the role that the media plays on young men specifically.
And that really ties into this idea of hazing rituals as sort of a place and a moment to assert one's masculinity in a particular case. Yeah. Patty, do you see, what have you seen about the media coverage of what happened in Somerville? Perhaps the positive and the negative and what you might have wanted to see differently?
I think it's been very difficult. There's been, this case involved one individual perpetrator who was considered an adult, and so a lot of the focus was on that individual, and then there are a couple of other juveniles. And so there's still a lot that we do not know about this case. So I love what you said about what's missing, and I think that the context of how this could happen, what the motives, and when we come back to hazing, it's the process of things unfolding, not maybe realizing what was about to unfold and the severity of what was to unfold, and the pain of the families of all the individuals involved. So all of these individuals are young people who have families, and as hard as it is, everyone is suffering with different concerns and different viewpoints, and I think that to recognize that the importance that we need to come together and stay together as a community to address this, and the more that we can understand what we can do to prevent this moving forward is really going to be the important focus. I mean, I think everyone gets caught up in the details and the specifics, and that's just, to some extent human nature. But if we can kind of take that curiosity to move towards understanding, as Riccardi was talking about, how can we better guide and impact young people's culture, and especially male roles. I think they've been changing over the decades, but there's still a lot that can be addressed in terms of how we model and what messages we're giving to young people about power and control, and developing into healthy individuals.
I think just what Patty was saying is power and control is what all abuse is about, and oppression and isolation. So I don't really know that much about hazing, but what I imagine, you can correct me, is that there is some message not to tell people about it, that to be part of the brotherhood or part of the collective, you have to be silent. And silence and isolation is sort of the glue that holds oppression in place. So what we want to do is help people not be so alone and not feel that they can't talk about what's happening to themselves, or to, as a bystander, to speak out on another's behalf. This isn't okay. It's also the teaching of empathy. They're really saying you were not going to hurt somebody if you could imagine the pain that you're causing to that person or their family or your own family. Or so in schools at a young age, to really be helping kids learn how to think about the other, to keep us in context, so that there's less of a focus on I and more on we. We're in this together.
Thank you all so much for spending time with us today to talk about this. We really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.